So we'll go over this. There's, a lot of these challenges, they start getting very open-ended, especially when it comes to styling and everything else. So there's a million different ways to do this. The way I'm going to do it is probably going to be fairly stripped down. So, visually it might not be too exciting, but if you wanted to go all out, you could definitely do that. So we've got a number guessing game. I'm going to go through the usual process here. I'm going to fork it. Okay, so now I have it in my account. So I'm going to clone it. Okay. And I've got all the basic stuff here. So app.js, index.html, and the styles.css. So the README says it's a little lengthy, but basically what we need to do is, let's see. So a user should be able to guess a number until they guess the right number. User should be able to input a number and click a button to submit the number. The web page should inform the user to guess a higher number, guess a lower number, or tell the user they guessed the correct number. The web page should list all guess numbers the user guessed during the session. Okay, so let's maybe start writing out a little bit of a plan. Ideally, we would choose a more visually stimulating way of doing this, but we'll just use a Word doc. So we can break this down. We can kind of break our problem down into different domains. So the first domain is going to be HTML. Well, I guess maybe 3. Count. We'll worry about CSS a little bit later, but for now we have HTML and then we have JavaScript. So for HTML, so what do we need to do HTML wise based on the requirements?
Probably just a div in the middle with an input.
Sorry, what was that? Create something?
Like create the framework for the whole
wireframe.
Okay, so we could do a wireframe, and that would be that's definitely a good idea. I think for this case, we really only need to have one component, so I'm gonna skip the wireframing. So for our HTML, we can look at the file that we're already given. So we have just a nav. So we have a header, a navigation element, and then the rest of our body. So if we read the requirements, what does it say the user should be able to do?
We need to create an input and we need to create a button.
Yeah. So I think for right now, for HTML, that's probably all we need to worry about. So create, let's say, okay, so if we create a text input and a submit button, we now have a way for a user to record a guess and then tell the rest of our program that they've submitted that guess. Okay, what about our JavaScript? What kind of things? So we have an HTML page, right? So we have this HTML page. Well, let's go ahead. Well, actually, let's think about how this is going to work first. So we have our HTML page and it's got a button on it. So we need to we need our JavaScript to access the value that the user is giving us, right? So I'm not asking for anyone to tell me how to code this, but what do we need to do in our JavaScript in order to make that happen?
Pull the input from the HTML.
Okay. So and do you happen to know how we can do that? If you don't, it's fine. Yeah.
It's with the
Uh,
document methods, but I'm trying to figure those out exactly.
Okay. Okay. That's fine. So we'll leave it like this for now. So get input from HTML. What else did we need to do? Let's look at our requirements again. So it doesn't explicitly say it, but something like this. So it's not really listed in our requirements, it's assumed. So the computer will pick a random number between 1 and 100. So where should we handle that?
JavaScript, just generate a number between 1 and 100.
Okay, so let's say I think for development purposes, we'll keep it to a much smaller range so that we can manually enter things and test it. But yeah. So 1 to 100. So we can generate a random number. We can get the user's input from the HTML. Is that it?
We need to be able to, they need to be able to click like the submit button. So you'd probably have to do like add an event listener.
Okay, good. So we can maybe break this down into, we can add another specific subtask here. So get input. So we'll do add event to we'll do, so we'll have a form which will include the input and the HTML, or the, sorry, the text input and the submit button, and we'll add an event listener to that. Okay. Also, so since we're talking about this, I'll also add that before we can add an event listener to something, we have to grab it, right? So somehow we have to point our JavaScript to that given element, and then we can add the event listener to it. So
you could create a variable and do like the get, I think it's query selector, I think, maybe.
Yeah. So there are a few different options. So that's good. Yeah, query selector is definitely one of them. We don't have to worry about the specific implementation right now, but yes, we will definitely grab form. Okay.
What is that called? It's a get something, or?
I mean, there are getters and setters, but this is a little bit different. So there's selectors. So there's query selectors, there's get element by ID. There's a whole bunch of get element by things. And then some of them are more or less specific, but they'll basically will do the same thing.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, so we can generate a random number. We can get the input. And in order to do that, we'll have to grab the element we want and then add an event listener to that element. And then, so what happens after the user guesses?
You have to check and see if it's the right number.
Yeah, so we'll have to so we'll check the user guess. And so we're gonna have to, this is a little tricky, right? So this looks like it's something we should be handling in HTML, but we don't really know what the user's guesses are going to be ahead of time. So we can't really include this in the HTML. So we'll have to generate this dynamically in JavaScript. So we're gonna have to display all of the user guesses. All right, so I think this is probably a good outline. There's a question, what happens when they guess the right answer, they get the right answer, or they're too high or too low. You can also display information there, but I think this is kind of the core functionality that we need. All right, so we have our plan for our HTML and our JavaScript. So let's go ahead and start writing that. So we have our nav here. So there are a few different ways to do this, but if we want to get user input, there's a form element. And the form element, again, there's more than one way to do this, but we can have an input field. And we can actually kind of further specify how this field is going to work. So we can give it a type. And the type will be text because we want the user to input text. And I guess we don't need to know it now, but this would also have a name so that we can refer to it. So we want to be able to grab the specific value that the user inputs. So this is a little easier to do if we give it a name, kind of just like in an object, right? We have a key and a value. So we'll just kind of make sure we have a key here. We can call it guess, we can call it whatever we want, user guess, anything like that. Okay, so we have input. So let's just try running this and see what happens. So I'm going to use, in order to run this, there's lots of options. I'm going to use something called live server. So it's an add-on in VS Code. You can, if you would like to use it, you can go into the extension store and do a search for live server. But it's nice because it does hot reloading. So anytime you save a change, it will be, you don't have to like close your window, then open it again every time you make a change. All right. So it looks like this kind of works. So we have our H1, and then we have our form. Now, nothing really happens. It looks like there is a submit event. So you can see that the URL changes. So this guess that we gave it, this is called a query string or query parameter. So anything after the question mark, it's making a get request. If you're on the server, you can pull this information out, just like any normal kind of search form. All right, but all right, so we've got our input. We can kind of leave it like this and work with that, but a more typical way of doing this would be to add a button. I think it says in the requirements that there needs to be a button. So again, there's more than one way to do this. So we use the button and then make it a submit button. And we'll just give it a name to display. So I saved it, it did a hot reload, so I didn't have to close it. And now I have guess. Okay. But this maybe is not the most helpful for a user. So we can also add a label. So it's not really functionally necessary, but you can add a label. And then we say, guess a number. And then if we just do it like this, that can work, but it's best to give it to associate the label with a given element. So we do for, this is the label for guess. So now we have, I think this is probably going to be good enough for now. So we have text input and we can submit. All right, so I think our HTML is mostly done. We might have to come back to this because we do need to store our users' guesses. But for now, yeah.
I have a question for you. What's the reason you would use name versus ID for your input?
So ID would be a CSS selector. It might be, you might be able to access it through ID as well, but
Gotcha. Okay.
yeah, I actually haven't tried doing that. This is just kind of the way people do it. Okay, so let's take a look at our JavaScript now. So we have a console log, so we can check our developer tools. So the shortcut for that is on a Mac, Option Command I, where you can come up here and go to more tools and developer tools. So if you look at the console, let's go ahead and refresh. So nothing is happening. So we have a JavaScript file, but our HTML page doesn't seem to know anything about it. And we get some helpful starter here. We say, so we need to give it a file path. So app.js, we'll include that. We'll save it. And then when we refresh, we get the console log. So now our JavaScript file is connected to our HTML page. So we can start doing things with it. So let's look at our plan again, just to see what we're doing. So first thing we need, generate a random number. So let's take care of that. We can generate a random number. Random num equals, so I'll just, rather than work through this, so math.floor. So it should be 1 to 100, but I'm just gonna keep it simple for testing purposes. Times 1, what is it? Times, no, that's not random. Times 3. Plus 1. All right, so this is just to exclude 0. So let's console log random num just to make sure it works. Okay, so we got a random number. We're getting random numbers, 1, 2, 3. Okay, cool. So we have a random number. So that part is taken care of. Now we need to get input from each. So this is going to be kind of a complicated one. So we need to get the user input from the HTML. So the first thing we have to do is grab the form. So a lot of ways to do this. We can do document. We can go ahead. We'll look at some more of this in during the lesson, but you can just see document object. It's got a whole bunch of stuff. Contains everything. There's also the window object, which has even more. So this document has some methods we can use. Document dot query selector. We could use get element by ID or get element by class name or whatever. Query selector is kind of a general purpose one, and we'll pass it in a string. So we could just grab it by the form tag. I'm gonna go ahead and give this form an ID, just in case we end up having multiple forms. So I'm going to label this form user guest form. And then here, it's an ID. So I have to refer to it with a hashtag. If it were a class, I would use dot. If it were just an element, I could just leave it by itself. So if I wanted to look for a paragraph tag or the first paragraph tag, then I would do that. So I'm going to do, what was that? Guess. User guess form. All right, so now I'm accessing this. So I'm going to assign this to a variable. And again, let's go ahead and console log that. And we can see here that we are in fact grabbing that form. All right, so we have our form, so that's great. The problem is that we can't really, it's not really useful in itself. We could, change properties and stuff on this form, but we kind of need to wait for the user to do something in order for us to react to that. So the way you do that with JavaScript, well, the kind of fundamental way is to use a callback. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up an event listener. And event listener is just going to be basically a signal that we're looking for. And if that signal comes through, then we're going to run a function that we tell it to run as a callback. So we'll see what that looks like. So we have a form. So my form, this is the form we care about. And what we want to listen for is a submit. So if there's an action, there's a million different actions or events that can happen in a web browser. One of them is the submit. So we're going to do add event listener. And this add event listener function is going to take two parameters. The first one is going to be a string of the event. So we're going to listen for a submit event. And the second parameter is going to be our callback function. So this will be, we could write this function outside and then just refer to it here, or we can just give the whole thing here. We'll just do this. So the function is going to take an event. It's going to get an event. And then the question is, what do we want to happen once we get a submit? So first thing we do is just console log. That's usually a good first step. Something like that. We can see if this works at all. Okay, so you guys can see that. It shows up for half a second and then disappears as my page refreshes. So the page refresh, so the form, HTML has, it's not just text. There's other stuff going on. So there's some default behaviors that are happening here. So what we're going to do is we're going to override those default behaviors. We just want to handle it the way we want to handle it. So we'll do E, and this is the event object. And by the way, let me just go ahead and console log. Well, let me prevent the default. So e.prevent default, that will stop the default behavior. And I'm going to also console log the event. Okay, so it's submitted, and here's the event that I get. It's a huge object with all kinds of stuff on it. Tells me there's a button, the event type was submit, the target was this form, which I gave an ID of user guess form, so it knows that this is where this event occurred, right? And there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on here. Okay, so we know that in outline, this is working. So we have grabbed an element on our HTML document in the DOM. We'll talk about that later. We've added an event listener, and we've added, we're going to listen for a submit event. And then when that submit event happens, when that event is triggered, we're going to run this callback function that we're currently making. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this stuff. We know this is working. We're going to leave the prevent default. So let's go back to our plan. So we can now get input from the HTML. Actually, so let's make sure we can actually get the specific value. So we're getting the whole form, but we want to check out just that form, just that given value. So we'll do so e.target. So we saw that there was, oh, it's not printing anymore, but there's a e.target. You can try doing something like this. So this is a standard thing. You might have to change this, but this is like a standard thing. So the events, the target of the event, which is whatever, whatever this is, and then the value, which is what we care about. I'm gonna have to, I think this is gonna throw an error, but just to show you, this is kind of a typical pattern. So this is undefined because it's not a single element. So it's not e.target.value. It'll be event.elements. And then it will be .guess because we have named this guess. So this is what we're trying to get at. And then we're going to get the value. So let's see if this works. Now property guess of undefined. I think it's element, sorry. No. Let's see, form that. Yeah, so it's my form dot element dot guess dot value. Let's try that. Form dot elements. Okay, finally. Okay, so this stuff, when you actually going through, so we'll look at more examples of actually looking at these objects in the browser. It's not always clear what the properties are, even though they often have very lengthy lists. So it can be a little tricky when you're trying to navigate, accessing different things that are available to you. But this is how we can access the particular user value here. So my form dot elements dot guess, because we've called it guess, and then we're accessing the value there. So now we can access the specific user guess. All right, so we go back to our plan. Now we need to check the user guess. So we're going to see, is that user guess? So we can write another function. Oops. And that will take a user guess. And we'll just say, so we actually need to check if it's correct or if it's higher or lower. So if we could do that in here also, so this might not be, yeah, okay, so we'll do this here. So if user guess equals, and So we're gonna have some issues here because we're getting input from a text file. So just like reading from a CSV, right? All you get is text. So if we want to make sure this is a number, we'll need to convert it to a number. You parse int. Okay, so we're taking the string input we get from the form and converting it into an integer. Then we can check if it equals num. Just for now, we'll do console.log. So if user guess is less than random num, it's greater than, we'll just console log too high. All right, so we've got our check user guess here. So we can try running it here maybe. To check user guess. All right. So let's see what happens. We can see that the answer is 1. So if we do 3, it's too high. We do 0, which it can't be, but that's fine. Too low. So we're not really handling error. We're not doing input validation or anything like, which we should be, but this is abbreviated. And if we do 1, it's correct. So it looks like we have the basic functionality now. So we can get the user input. We can check their guess. And then we also need to display all of the user guesses. So in our HTML, this is hard coded. So it's not a lot we can do. I'm just going to go ahead and add a starter element for us, just to kind of make it clear what our intentions are here. So I'm going to call this, I'll give it a class. I'll make it a class. So this will be called something like that. So if I refresh and look, so nothing has changed on the browser. I can go to my elements and I can see that I have a new div here, but it doesn't really make any difference visually. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end up attaching, I'm going to create in my JavaScript file nodes, DOM nodes, then I'm going to attach them here so that they can be displayed. All right. So there's a few places we can do that. So I'm going to do, I'll just create another function. Node. And that will take a user guess. And we can put this in a few different places. I think all the well, maybe if it's correct, we don't need to display it necessarily. Well, that'll be fine. So we'll just call this, this is not the best design, so we can look at how we could refactor this at the end. We'll do create node, user guess. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab the thing when anytime the user submits, we're going to grab the value that they submitted in the form, and we're going to check their guess. And if it, depending if it's correct, too low or too high, we'll console log for now. And then we're going to create a node, which we're going to write right now. So how do we create a node? Does anyone? Happen to know?
You can use create element.
Okay, yeah. So just like, and where is create element?
In the document.
Yes. So there's a whole bunch of stuff on document. Whoop. Create element. And we can have our choice here. I'll just make it a p tag for simplicity. So we'll create a paragraph. So does that mean we're done? We've created a new element.
We have to give it something to display.
Okay, so we need to fill in the content. So these elements also will have a property, a p tag, and lots of other tags called inner HTML or inner text, something like that. So they can do slightly different things, but document, whoops. So let me save this to a variable first off. So we have a new element. So we've just created a new element, but it's just floating in space. It doesn't have any content. So new p dot inner text, let's say. It will be, well, maybe we can change our function here. Maybe we can pass in something like that. Actually, maybe we don't need to do that, but so we'll forget about that for now. As you guess the text. I guess we could do both. So let's do, we'll concatenate these. So user. Okay, so we've created this p tag, and now we're basically filling in the text content, right? So just like in our, whatever we, for example, right here, this is like the inner text. So the text that goes in between tags. Okay, so we're gonna change the text there, and so we're done now, right? We've created a p tag and we've told it what we want inside of it. Doesn't look like it's working. Why is it not displaying my brand new p tag?
You have to add it to
Yeah,
your HTML file. Yeah.
yeah. So this is still just floating. This isn't attached to anything. So my HTML document doesn't know anything about this. So we have to attach it. So we have this nice little attachment point that we can use. So how do we do that? How do we attach it?
Append it to the body.
So yeah, we could append to the body. I kind of created this so that we could append it to this specific element. So how do we tell it where to append to? Or where to append?
You could use a append child.
Okay, but append child to what?
The whatever element you grab.
Okay, so how do I do the grabbing?
So first you
Document.
get element by ID on that div,
Okay,
assign it to a variable, and then with that variable, you can go dot append child.
okay, I think I put a class on here, so I'm just going to use a query selector. And we use the dot. Then what did I call that? User guesses. Okay, so now I'm grabbing that div that I want to attach it to, and I do my div dot append child, and I'll put my new paragraph tag. So I'm getting access to this DOM elements, my div, and I'm adding a new child element to it. We can see if this works. Okay, so it looks like this, I mean, obviously this looks very ugly, but it appears to be working. Okay, so this works, I think. I mean, I think we've kind of covered all the basics. We display all user guesses, we check the guess, we can tell them if they're too low or too high. So I think in terms of bare minimum, this is fine. We can make this slightly more interesting maybe by using some CSS. But I think I'll maybe save that for the lecture, since we're already approaching an hour for this.
What is that? Can you go back? What is that prevent default
Yeah.
thing you did? Why do we have to do that?
Because if we do a form submission, we'll automatically basically try to make a GET request to, by default, the origin page, but you can tell it what kind of request and where to make it. But so it's basically going to refresh the page. So we could, I mean, we could design this in such a way that it handles that, but preventing the default, especially on forms, is a very common thing that you'll see. Preventing the default is basically the default. Okay.
Chad, I had a quick question on the way that the JavaScript and the HTML are interacting. So I saw that you added an event listener on the JavaScript waiting for the button to be submitted.
Yeah.
The way I did it was in the HTML, it said on click, call the function. Is there a best practice? Is one preferred over the other? Or is both fine? Or
I don't, it probably, so when we get to React, it'll be, I mean, React is designed a little bit different. So you'll be attaching event listeners to basically JSX elements, which, essentially like what you did. For something like this, I think it's probably better to separate things out. So you have, clear separation between HTML and JavaScript.
Gotcha, thank you.
Yeah. But yeah, there's always more than one way to do these things. So we could try, I mean, so one issue we have now is this is fine and it works aside from the fact that it looks terrible. But we just have we got some variables floating around and you got some functions floating around. you could try cleaning this up into a class. So let me just go ahead and I don't know if I want to spend time doing that. So I think what I'll do is, so I have made this a class as well. So I'll put a link to that code under the video description. And if you're interested, I also, I've personally been the last few days looking at something called finite state machines. So I have an implementation of this using a finite state machine. So if you're interested in that, you can take a look. I'll also include a link. And if you see anything wrong with that, since I'm just playing around with it, please let me know. All right, so I think that's good for now. So what we'll do is I'll push this up and then we could take a 10-minute break and we'll come back and we'll have the lecture.